Hi guys, happy International Women's Day. I'm Dr. Molly and I am a naturopathic doctor with a clinical focus in hormonal health. So to celebrate today, I thought that I would put together a short video of me reviewing the reproductive cycle graph. Hopefully I'll keep this pretty short. We're just going to briefly go over this. Obviously we can get a lot more in depth, but I think that today will be a nice foundation of understanding what's going on in your body throughout your cycle. So we'll start by just orienting you to this graph. If we focus on the y-axis over here, I want you to think of this top level as being what's happening in your brain, this second level being what's happening in your ovary, the third level is what's happening in your blood, and this fourth level is what's happening in your uterus. Along the x-axis, we see the number of days that are in our cycle. So this graph is based off a 28-day cycle, but keep in mind that a normal cycle can vary between 21 even up to 35 days long. And so whatever is normal and regular for you, is great. And that just means that this graph could vary a little bit for you if we're looking at this x-axis. So we're going to just review today by looking at the graph in two sections. So I want you to think of everything prior to this dotted line being pre-ovulation. This is known as our follicular phase. And then everything after this dotted line or ovulation, post-ovulation, is called our luteal phase. So if we just start in our brain and we kind of have a look at what's happening, so our brain starts by releasing something called FSH, which stands for follicular stimulating hormone. And that's doing exactly what the name says. So that hormone is traveling from our brain and it's going and communicating to our reproductive organs that we want to stimulate a follicle. And so our follicle, which are all hanging out in our ovaries, that encompass our eggs, start to grow because it's being told to by our brain. So our egg is this darker pink purple color and our follicle is this lighter pink color. So as FSH is released, we start growing our follicle bigger and bigger. And those pink cells, or that follicle, the cells that make up our follicle, are going to be releasing estrogen into our blood. And so during this follicular phase, we start to see estrogen rising. And this is why estrogen becomes our quote-unquote dominant hormone during the first half of our cycle. Estrogen's highest, estrogen's running the show. We're relying on primarily estrogen to be signaling the rest of our body. And so as estrogen's growing, we see that estrogen's telling our uterus and the lining inside of your uterus, it's telling that lining to get thicker. So it's growing and proliferating to make sure that it's nice and thick. Eventually, estrogen in our blood hits a certain threshold. And when it hits this point, it sends a signal to our brain that says, okay, I'm all good. I've got enough estrogen. I've grown my follicle nice and big. Our egg is all prepared and ready to go. And our brain says, okay, so it shoots up this thing called luteinizing hormone, which is going to tell our ovaries that it's time to release the egg. And so our egg gets released from the follicle in our ovary, and it gets picked up by these arm-like projections coming from our uterus, and it travels down the arm-like projection into our uterus. After ovulation, we see estrogen levels start to fall because, again, these pink cells, we don't have them anymore. These pink cells have become these yellow cells, which are called lutein cells, which make up our corpus luteum. Corpus luteum is going to be pumping out progesterone, which is why we see progesterone start to get nice and high and dominant in the second half of our cycle. Progesterone is telling our uterus to maintain this nice, thick, healthy level or thickness of our endometrium. Eventually, in the absence of pregnancy, our corpus luteum begins to die off. And as it dies off, progesterone falls. And it's this fall in progesterone or this drop in progesterone that tells our body there's no baby coming. We don't need this really thick layer in our uterus. And so we begin to bleed out that endometrial lining, which is what's known as our period.